Americans really are ready to be post-racial. They just don't give a damn. And let's be honest, white Republicans have had one love affair after another with black Republicans. The race doesn't matter, their values matter.
This whole issue with BLM saying that they don't want the police in the communities, they want to defund the police. And the communities that need the police more than anyone, they're the ones that are getting those resources taken away from them.
And, I mean, you're going into sort of a very difficult place, Xavier, because I'm not going to deny there is a divided consciousness in a lot of black communities where, yes, they're the victims, but let's be honest, they're also voting for the anti-cop activists and politicians.
Hello, everyone. I'm Xaviaer DuRousseau here at PragerU, and I'm sitting down with the legendary Heather McDonald. How are you today?
Xavier, I'm great to be talking with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. Thank you for your time. You know, you're one of those people that have a very extensive resume, and anytime I see someone with as long of a resume as yours, I'm fascinated to see how you summarize it. So go ahead and let the audience know, who's Heather McDonald?
Well, I'm always trying to learn something new about the world, and I started out in academics. Academics left me behind by becoming completely insane, destroying everything that I love and that which professors should love. So I ended up becoming a journalist and trying to figure out the world. And if you're curious about things, it's a very good profession. And right now, I guess I find myself sadly in defense mode to try and preserve the things that I think we should all be down on our knees in gratitude for, of Western civilization, science, beauty, literature, art, successful economy, prosperity, all of which now is being destroyed by people that know nothing about how lucky we are to be here today.
I could not agree with that more. And you certainly have been a pioneer in helping this shift that we are starting to see in society. Because I don't know if you still see it as going downhill, and while there is a movement to make things go downhill, I do think we're right there on the cusp of things really starting to turn around. And when I was just looking at just some of your work and how long you've been looking at some of these issues, I was very, very excited to see that you had your foot on the neck of BLM way before 2020.
Yeah.
You have been working on exposing how fraudulent that organization and that movement really have been for so long. And I'm just curious, were you immediately skeptical when BLM started to rise, or what was it that was like a wake-up call?
Well, I started writing about policing in 1999 in New York City with the tragic shooting of Amadou Diallo, the West Guinean immigrant that was shot 41 times by 4 police officers that had been doing undercover gang suppression work. And the New York Times and the rest of the mainstream media immediately turned this tragic, aberrant shooting into the very symbol of the New York Police Department. And I knew enough about the world at that point to say that whatever the New York Times was claiming deserved to be treated with some skepticism. And I had not really been involved in criminal justice work before, but I started going out into communities that the New York Times was telling us felt oppressed by the police in Rudolph Giuliani's mayoralty. And what I heard again and again was, we want more police. I would go to police community meetings in the South Bronx, in central Brooklyn, in East Harlem, and these fantastic elderly women would stand up with these amazing hats and say, "Thank God the police are here. They're my friends." I spoke with a cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who told me the only time she felt safe to go to her building's lobby to pick up her mail was when the police are there, because it was otherwise overtaken by trespassing youth who were smoking weed and selling drugs. These are the people that the New York Times never talked to, that depend on the police to give them a sense of safety. And my heart went out for them. Their voices were not being heard. And this was the time of driving while black. You know, we were supposed to believe that the police were gratuitously stopping blacks because of the color of their skin at night when you couldn't even see the race of drivers. And I did an article about black police officers. And they, you know, one guy said, if I stop a black driver, the first thing out of his mouth is, "You only stopped me because I'm black." And I'll say, "No, I stopped you because you ran a red light." And one of the most kind of uplifting experiences was going to police precincts because they truly were post-racial. Americans yearn to be post-racial today. We are not being allowed to be post-racial by the race hustlers, by the race activist industry. But in a police precinct, you have whites, you have Hispanics, you have blacks, you have Asians. They are all united in their support for law and order. And they care about the victims. They are the only people who care about the victims. As you say, Black Lives Matter is a hustle. I have yet to see a Black Lives Matter activist protest when a black child is gunned down by a black gangbanger. Never happens. They don't give a damn about the victims. It's all about hating whites, hating the police, and they don't care about the fact that when you dismantle law enforcement, when you discredit the police, when you demoralize the police, they're going to back off, and guess who suffers? The innocent blacks who are trying to make a living, who are trying to educate their kids, the elderly who cannot go to the grocery store or to the post office to cash their check. It breaks my heart, and those people are being ignored today by the BLM activists.
It's like these movements are so loud that they're suppressing the voices that really need to be heard.
Exactly.
I'm actually working on a short documentary here at PragerU where we went over to Chicago and we interviewed some parents whose children were murdered while playing outside their grandmother's house on 4th of July. Their kids were getting a haircut and they ended up dying because of stray gang violence.
Right.
And what's so shocking to me is that they were really expecting their community to all come behind them, to be in support, to have at least some sustained outrage that was actually going to create change. But what they realized is that in a lot of these cities, because of movements like BLM taking up the whole conversation, that everything that they had to say was being suppressed. Nobody cared for more than 48 hours about what was happening to the children of these communities. And it's so much so that I agree with you 100% when you're saying that a lot of the people you talk to in these communities, they 100% want the police to be there more, if not at least as much as they are. But it's weird because now you have this whole issue with BLM saying that they don't want the police in the communities. They want to defund the police. And the communities that need the police more than anyone, they're the ones that are getting those resources taken away from them.
And, you're going into sort of a very difficult place, Xavier, because I'm not going to deny, there is a divided consciousness in a lot of Black communities where, yes, they're the victims, but let's be honest, they're also voting for the anti-cop activists and politicians. Brandon Johnson was made mayor of Chicago running on an anti-cop platform, and he was voted in by the South and West sides of Chicago. So it is kind of perplexing to people who don't live in those high crime communities why there has not been a complete political revolution. So I can say that I'm giving voice to a lot of people who are not being heard, but I'm not going to pretend that that is necessarily either a majority view or one that is translating into the ballot box. It's very strange. Why do they keep putting these left-wing Democrats in power that are behind the movement to delegitimize the police?
An interesting point is like I saw in a recent article of yours that you were talking about ShotSpotter and how just the reaction to that was not as positive as it really should have been. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, ShotSpotter is a technology that picks up the sound of shootings just through acoustic monitors. And the reason that this is important is because, bizarrely, in high crime neighborhoods where drive-by shootings are sadly routine, a lot of those shootings don't get called into the police. And so ShotSpotter does alert the police that there's been a shooting on this corner. And it has many important aspects, one of which is that it allows first responders to get there very quickly. If nobody's calling in and somebody's been shot and he's bleeding to death on the sidewalk, ShotSpotter at least allows the EMS technicians to show up and maybe save a life. But because we're in a world now where anything that tells us the sad reality about inner city pathologies and breakdown is per se racist, now we're supposed to believe that ShotSpotter technology is racist, even though a camera or a microphone doesn't know the race of the people that it's picking up or doing these shootings. But you have now a movement in Chicago to get rid of ShotSpotter technology. And the hilarious thing is Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, that goes around saying, well, the reason kids are marauding on the Magnificent Mile and, assaulting elderly people is because they lack opportunities. Let's ignore the fact that they have smartphones, and my definition of somebody who lacks opportunity is not somebody who has a smartphone. I think they're like mutually exclusive. But Brandon Johnson says we got to get rid of ShotSpotter technology because it's a racist technology, because it shows us that guess where the shootings are happening? In Black neighborhoods. So he was in this, we're going to end the contract, but he said, but you can't end it before the DNC convention. So he wants to hold on to it. And the ShotSpotter heads were so weak and puling and compliant that they said, all right, we know you don't love us any longer, but we'll stay around for the convention and then we'll leave in the fall. But it's really bad, so that we're so desperate to come up with racism as the explanation for things that we're even going to say that red light cameras are racist or speeding cameras are racist if they show us, to get back to this driving while black problem, that will actually blacks do drive faster. There was a study done.
I'm going to say the red light cameras being racist. I'm all in favor of that one. Anything to get rid of those.
I would. Okay. Well, a lot of people want to get rid of them. A lot of people want to get rid of the speeding cameras too. Let's not. It's not just a race issue. And my view is, if you're nabbed by a speeding camera, God, thank God, you should be out of here. So,
I agree with that. With the speeding cameras, with the red light ones, it's like, let me run a red light in peace.
I want to sort of go the rolling red stoplights. I would agree with that. Like if I get caught on this rolling through the stop sign, I'm going to be mad too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I just can't stop thinking about that ShotSpotter one, because anyone who is against that, I feel like you have to be a perpetrator of crime. And because you're telling me that you have a way for the police to be able to show up faster in the event that someone in your community is getting shot and you're against that.
Right.
That's exactly why I say we do not have a systemic racism issue. We have a systemic disempowerment issue. Because if you are telling the community that this is something bad for them, all you're really saying is that you're trying to brainwash them to not want their own best interests. And that's exactly what the left has been doing to the Black community, and why we've seen this weird slope. Because I'm a part of Gen Z, and I remember, like, as a kid, just seeing it was becoming more and more irrelevant what your race was, and then all of a sudden it's like this huge spike where now we're looking at things even in retrospect that had nothing to do with race. No one felt it was racially charged back then, but suddenly that's the forefront of every single conversation. So much so that we now have things like the Racial Justice Act.
It's too bad, because as I say, Americans really are ready to be post-racial. They just don't give a damn. And let's be honest, white Republicans have had one love affair after another with black Republicans. The race doesn't matter. Their values matter. Whether it's Ben Carson, or Alan Keyes or Alan West or Burgess Owens or Colin Powell. They don't care. They want, are you patriotic? Do you believe that there's value in America? And we would so love to just be able to, let's finally live up to our deals, which we violated for so long in such heartbreaking, gratuitously cruel a way, but let's just get beyond it. But no, there's too many interests involved, and there's power in being a victim. And let's face it, right now there's power in being black. Being black is now an accomplishment. And so you specialize in being black, just as the ways I could specialize in being female if I wanted to. But I know for a fact that being female is not an accomplishment. Being gay is not an accomplishment, but you can specialize in being gay. That gives you extra points. And now the biggest points is being trans, and that gets you to the top of the status ladder in high school. It gets you attention. And so it's asking a lot of people to give up an easy ticket for success and status and privilege, which is what being a minority is today. And the weird thing is the majority culture plays along with this and is willing to completely demonize itself, I would say, without any justification today. In the past, yes. If you want to talk about white supremacy and it's 1930s, 1940s, 1950s America, yes, that was true. And it was heartbreaking to see those successful bourgeois blacks who are trying to follow the ideals of middle-class culture, whether it's Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, dressed to the nines, and still being told you don't get a hotel room. That is heartbreaking. And that they could still believe in America is beyond my understanding. I frankly would not hold it against blacks to have that second question of 4th of July, the great Frederick Douglass speech in 1854 about the 4th of July. Well, why should we feel patriotic? That was completely justified. And I'm sympathetic to people saying, but wait a minute, this was a very problematic country, but today we have changed and we have to recognize that and give up on the race hustle, because that's not the way to live up to your potential. Or it's not my way to live up my potential as a female, to go around with a chip on my shoulder saying, well, because maybe females were not given equal rights in the past, but maybe there was reason for that. I'm just going to put that in. Going to put it in. Sorry. That I should feel like I'm a victim today, when in fact, if I'm honest, I'm going to know that if I'm applying to Cornell Engineering School and I'm a female, I've got a 300% better chance of getting admitted than if I'm a male. That is not fair, and it is not how we advance science and engineering. So we've got to get away from this glorifying victims and hating success, because that's the sort of script that we're all living by now in our country.
It's sad when you hear those things about DEI and affirmative action and just how much they lower the bar for whether you're a woman or you're black or
Right.
you're just going to get everything. If you're
Right.
black, trans, disabled,
Right.
Islamic, whatever the new buzzword is
Right.
of that time period. And it's like, I wonder, how can you even truly cherish these accomplishments when you know that the bar is being lowered for you?
Right.
And then what that does is it creates this cycle of people being bitter with each other because they're lowering the bar, and then even those who successfully made it to that position or that status by doing the hard work,
Yeah.
they're going to inherently have people questioning,
I know.
did you actually earn it?
I know.
Because a lot of people in your demographic didn't. And
Yeah.
that's what people do, that reinstills those prejudices and those racial biases where people look at you and no longer assume that you have worked as hard as you have.
Right.
And I largely blame the large universities
Mm-hmm.
for that purpose or
Right.
for that fact.
Right. Well, it's also in the corporate world. There was a law professor at Yale Law School named Stephen Carter who in the 1990s wrote a book called Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby. And he talked about the dichotomy between being the best and being the best black. And he said he lived with that stigma and that self-doubt. When he's chosen to be a Yale law professor or gets that promotion to be a chaired professor or gets asked to be on that panel, is it because he's the best or is it because he's the best black? It's the same with females. I know for a fact I've been put on panels that I know nothing about because they needed a female, which is preposterous. I could not care less if I go to a scientific conference and it's all males. And it's a mantle. Do you know the phrase mantle, Xavier?
I don't.
Okay, well, the former head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, sent out a call to the biomedical community to boycott mantles. A mantle is a conference or a panel that is predominantly male. And he said, this is the guy who is the head of our grant-making federal agency to advance science. He said, I'm not going to go to a mantle, and I don't want anybody else to. So if you're doing a conference on neurology, and it turns out that the best neurologists are all males, they could be white, they could be Asian, they could be black, they could be Hispanic, that's unacceptable. You got to put some females on that panel, or I'm not going to go. This is preposterous. It should not matter. It is not, as I say, it's not an accomplishment to be female, and it's not an accomplishment to be black. Now, as far as how people understand it, I've heard two things. I remember once doing a TV interview with Buck Sexton back when he was still in Washington, before he was Buck and Clay on the radio. And we were talking about racial preferences in college admissions. This was with my book, The Diversity Delusion. I got off the set and a young black man came up to me and said, well, I'm one of those people you were talking about. I got into Harvard. And he basically was honest enough to accept I got in thanks to racial preferences, but his view was I deserved it because I'm black. And somehow I was owed it. And I'm so wonderful. I was such a great addition to Harvard that, you know, I feel no guilt about that. So that's one view that I've heard, which is, yes, I'm the beneficiary of preferences, but I deserve it. That you are going to be admitted, if you're black, you're going to be admitted to medical school and law schools with test scores, whether it's the LSAT or the medical college admissions test, MCATs for medical school, which would be automatically disqualifying if presented by whites and Asians. If you're a white male, you do have to be 10 times better than anybody else because it's discriminating against you. It's black privilege today, not white privilege. But as you say, there are many blacks who are whooping their own average, and they're whooping people in other groups' ass as well, because they are studying, they're putting in the work, they are mastering the periodic table, they are mastering physics, and they would get in on their own merits. And as you say, the suspicion is always going to hang over them. Are they there because of preferences, or did they earn it? And that's really a tragic thing for those people that have lived up to bourgeois values, that have put in the work, and thanks to preferences, one's never going to know, unless they go around with their, test scores on their backs or something. But it's unfair on an individual basis, and it's also unfair because it unwinds the competitive pressure. I mean, Asians are getting better and better, let's face it.
Yeah.
Asians are taking over. They're the Jews. Jews are now sort of, they're second-class intellects in college. But the Asians have to go through an ever smaller eye of the needle to be admitted because they're so successful, and their parents are just like not accepting anything less than an A or an A+, and they're living up to the standards. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very honest. I periodically say, I don't want to write about race issues any longer because I find it really depressing. I find it really depressing to hear again and again from some blacks, not all blacks, not people like you, put in the work and meet the standards. It's what Jews have done. They were discriminated against. They were kept out of country clubs. They were kept out of banks. They were kept out of Sullivan and Cromwell and, the fancy white shoe law firms. And they said, we're going to be so damn good that you're going to have to admit us. And that's what happened. And that would happen with blacks, too. It's already happening. I mean, blacks are being admitted anyway under racial preferences. But just meet the standards. You can do it. Don't demand they be lowered on your behalf.
I mean, you can't rise to low expectations.
Exactly.
And what people don't realize, it's still a domino effect, because I actually have been paying a lot of attention to the Asian community lately, because they are just internationally becoming more and more and more advanced compared to what we're doing here in America.
Yep.
But even Asians who grow up here in America, their bar and expectation that they have to reach in order to get to the same position at the same university in the same program is significantly higher.
Right.
So the thing that a lot of people don't think about is many of these courses or many of these just directions in their entire career are going to be based on a curve. They're still ultimately going to want whoever is the best.
Right.
So when you have the most top of the line, highest performing Asian with an average black person who made it because the standards were lowered, and this Asian person who was the best of the best because the standards were so high, they're still not competing. So then what ends up happening is a lot of these black students end up in academic probation, or they end up performing significantly worse than they expected to because of who they're competing against.
Right. And
And then it becomes another thing of, oh, well, their university's racist. Oh, they're not giving me enough resources. I'm not getting the support, the attention I want. But really what it is you were set up to fail time and time again.
Right.
And you were told and repackaged and sold this lie that it was for your own benefit.
Right. I know. And the great civil rights leaders, whether it's Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington, that would just said, just work hard. That's what it takes. we have data, blacks do 1/4 the amount of time on homework than Asians do, or I think than whites even. So Asians, you can imagine it's way off the curve. You got to do the work. You can't expect things to be given to you, but you're a little bit more of an optimist, Xavier, because you think there actually will be a final reckoning where there's not double standards and that at the end of the line, you're going to be going for merit and not race. I'm not sure that's happening. All the way through medical school into medical licensing, standards are being lowered. We've got double standards on the basis of race. So people do get pushed along. But it is so insidious. The poison is so deep. We always hear about, well, affirmative action, racial preferences are a success because you see we've got Vernon Jordan or the American Express head who gets mentioned all the time. But I'm sorry, I'm enough of a cynic that I sort of feel I'm not sure that any position at this point is not because of the need for diversity. And again, the people who are blamed for that suspicion, I don't blame myself for that suspicion. I blame the people that are pushing racial preferences. That there's actually, unless you know what that person's academic background is, frankly, there is not a position that you can be confident the person hasn't gotten there thanks to the so-called need for diversity. It's really, really poisonous. If we got rid of all preferences today, blacks would have no doubt. We would know that everybody was there because of qualifications. And you wouldn't have to worry if you're in an emergency room and a black doctor walks in the door, you don't have to think, oh my God, do I want to hurt this person's feelings because I cannot be confident that he has passed the same standards as everybody else. And frankly, I'm going to be honest, that is what every person worries about. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe black patients don't, but it is what whites worry about, because if you know anything about the ubiquity of racial preferences, it's not because of blacks, it's because of the preferences themselves that you cannot be sure.
And it's a shame that we've gotten to that point.
Yep.
I do have one more question for you. So when affirmative action was created, it was always said that it was supposed to be temporary until we don't need it anymore. Roughly, and I know it's hard, you can't really pinpoint a year, but what era would you say that it was no longer needed, or do you believe that it never was needed from the beginning?
Well, the advocates hold on to the term affirmative action because it's an ambiguous term. I prefer racial preferences. One possible meaning for affirmative action that I think they're trying to make you believe it only means that is extra outreach. We're going to make sure that we've cast a very wide net, or possibly tie-breaking. Nobody has an objection if you have two equally qualified candidates and one is black and one is white. I'm going to give it to the black every time because one just wants to. And so if it was only that, if it was only making sure that you know that your standards are justified and you're going to make sure that you've tried to find everybody out there to apply, that's okay. But when it was a question of lowering standards, I never would have done that because the data is clear. If you bring somebody in under lower standards on a job or in an academic environment and they're not competitively qualified, that's not a good thing to do. That is not a kind thing to do. They're going to struggle. Let's take it out of race and put it into gender. If MIT decides it needs more females because it needs to have gender equity, which makes me want to throw up, and it admits me to MIT, and the peer average to MIT is 800 on the math SATs on an 800-point scale. So most people who are admitted without gender preferences to MIT have 800, but I'm admitted with 650s on an 800-point scale because they've got to get their females in. What's going to happen to me my first year at MIT? In my freshman calculus class, I'm going to struggle because the class is legitimately and normally pitched to my peer average. People that have advanced further in their high school training than I did. And I'm going to struggle to keep up. And I'm going to fall behind. I'm going to need remedial work. And I'm not going to be able to proceed with my STEM aspirations, my science, technology, engineering, and math aspirations at the same rate as my peers. And lo and behold, Here comes the diversity bureaucrats telling me, if you feel out of place, if you feel like you're not doing as well, it's because you're in a patriarchal environment. You're in the rape culture. You are being set up to fail by white supremacist, sexist expectations. And I'm probably going to accept that as an explanation. And I am not, if I had been admitted with my 650 math SATs to a college where my peers had 650 on their math SATs, whether it's, and excuse me if I'm insulting Boston College, I'm just coming up with something that may not be MIT, but let's say Boston College or Boston University has a 650 average, then I'm going to succeed in STEM because I will be learning at the rate of my peers. And that's what happens to Black students as well. We know that they drop out of STEM majors at very high rates because they have been inevitably catapulted more ahead of them. It's very cruel to Blacks. They're like the one group that are forced to bear that handicap. It never should have come into place. It wasn't right in the 1960s to Blacks. It was unfair to Blacks. We can say it's unfair to whites. Yeah, it is unfair to whites. But the real people who suffer are the ones who are being put into an academic environment where it is a statistical inevitability that they will struggle, and that is cruel. And it's done because of these damn college presidents who are so self-righteous, so narcissistic that they want to look over their student body and feel like they are the fighters against white supremacy, and they're doing their little noblesse oblige of admitting their little Black students, you know. You should hear the way college admissions counselors talk. It is so offensive. This came out during the lawsuit against Harvard and the University of North Carolina for racial preferences. And they got transcripts of the University of North Carolina admissions officers talking about their little brown people that, well, I'd really like to give this scholarship to this little brown person, but sorry, you know, the grades are just too low. It's completely paternalistic and condescending.
I could not agree more. It's disgusting to hear that.
Yep.
It's very, very degrading. And these are the people who are fully convinced that they're the ones looking out for people of color the most.
Exactly.
But they truly view minorities as inferior.
Exactly.
But someone like you who views people of color at their own capabilities,
Right.
they call you a racist.
Yeah.
Isn't that ironic? Well, I don't think you're racist.
Well, thank you.
And I very much appreciate your time here today.
A great conversation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.